morning and welcome to this policy exchange debate on the future of infrastructure and how we can sort of get beyond some of the issues around building in our own backyards and NIMBYism. We've got a great panel this morning to talk on the subject. To my left, my immediate left, is Tim Yeo, Chairman of the House of Commons Select Committee on Energy and Climate Change. In the middle, next to him, is Gabe Winn, Corporate Affairs Director of Centrica, our sponsor. And on the far left is Ben Page, Chief Executive of IPSOS MORI. To the far right, Simon Moore, Senior Research Fellow in Environment and Energy at the Policy Exchange. And just to my immediate right is Matthew Pencharz, who's Senior Advisor to Boris, Mayor of London, on energy and the environment. We're going to kick off each sort of panelist will speak for 5 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions. Tim, would you like to start off?
Oh, I thought I was going to finish. Okay, I was just going to start making some notes. Thank you very much for inviting me. I think the key points really in 5 minutes are the solution for UK energy policy is to allow the market to work better, and eventually I hope we will find we can scrap all the regulations and targets if we have a proper carbon price, but that may be some years away. That is the right market solution, and that would drive the right investment decisions. The components of a successful energy policy in this country to achieve the 3 goals of security, affordability and greenery, the components have to be that there are a number of cores. Clearly we're going to go on using a lot of gas in the immediate future for the next 20 years or so, although gas cannot be the principal permanent part of our energy supply. But because we are going to use a lot of gas, I strongly favour fracking, and I think it was a very encouraging announcement yesterday from INEOS saying that they're prepared to share the benefits of gas development more generously with local communities than anyone has proposed so far. That has to be the right way to get shale gas exploitation kick-started in this country. It's a perfectly safe technology, but communities are very fearful of it, and therefore we need to, frankly, to bribe them into getting one or two going in that way. Their fear will be removed. Exploiting our own resources will not lead to an increase necessarily in the consumption of gas. It will give us a chance to replace imports. It's better to use our own resources than to import from Qatar. Luckily we don't import much from Russia, and so I favour that. The second component has to be clearly nuclear. Nuclear still generates a substantial proportion of our electricity. We cannot get through the next 50 years and get anywhere near our carbon emission targets without a substantial contribution from nuclear. It's an opportunity for the UK to lead a global revival of the nuclear power industry. There is great interest in investing in this country from China, from South Korea, from Russia, from America, because we have the gold standard regulator here. We have a bipartisan support from the government for nuclear. We have a surprisingly high degree of public acceptance of it, but Parliament has an excellent reputation of the regulator and the industry in this country. There would be substantial, not just energy benefits, but economic benefits if Britain actually accelerates down this road, and I hope that we will continue to welcome overseas participation in the nuclear industry. The third element has to be other low-carbon electricity generation technologies. Solar will soon be at grid parity, therefore will not need any subsidy by the end of this decade. Onshore wind has the capacity to reach grid parity. I always hesitate to say anything good about onshore wind in front of a Conservative audience because it produces the most fearsome reactions. Of course, local communities should have the final decision about whether wind turbines are built within sight or sound of their homes or businesses. But we should not have a blanket policy of ruling out onshore wind. That would be completely irrational. That will also reach grid parity, not quite as quickly as solar, but reasonably soon. And again, if we allowed the same opportunities to incentivise local communities to have a share in the benefits of allowing low-carbon technologies like solar, like wind, like nuclear, that we're proposing for shale gas, that would be very helpful. It introduces a market element into the decisions about where infrastructure assets are located, and I'm all in favour of giving people a direct financial gain if they're prepared to put up with something which other people consider to be inconvenient. Coal there will be no role for in the future unless we crack the carbon capture and storage issue. There is no sign in my view that we're even remotely near finding an economic technology which will deal with carbon capture and storage. I wish we did. That would be important for the whole world. It would be wonderful, but to be realistic, it's just not on the horizon. I think in terms of planning issues, I don't think we can have a single overarching planning policy. I think we have to continue to recognise that smaller developments will be subject to a local decision. Large ones clearly have to be centrally led, and the more we can get things done quickly, the better. The hidden cost to business and consumers of the slowness of our planning process is something which we need to pay far more attention to. The last point, I'm trying to do this in 5 minutes, there's lots of things I could say. The last point, which is really important, the technology that's developed in the last literally 3 to 5 years for demand-side response to form a big part of our solution to capacity challenges has not been fully recognised yet. DEC have paid lip service to it, but if you look at what's happening in America, the opportunity to pay people to switch off their consumption at very short notice, and the software that's available to organise this is dramatically improved. That actually is a better way to address capacity problems than to build lots more generating capacity. There's a danger that the decisions that are being made literally in the next few weeks about the way the capacity market is going to operate will only incentivize people to build more generators, instead of which the cheapest, the greenest, and the right long-term solution is to throw our weight fully behind a rapid expansion of demand-side response. I think that's a little introduction on something.
Thanks. Gabe, from the industry perspective.
Sure. Thanks, James. Well, it's great to be speaking about this in Birmingham. This is a city that was quite literally built on its energy infrastructure. And listening to the Chancellor yesterday, I was a bit gutted because he stole some of my lines. He was evoking the industrial history of this city by talking about the Golden Boys. So I'm going to evoke a slightly different name, which is Joe Chamberlain. Joe Chamberlain in the 1870s took the profits from 2 energy companies in Birmingham and used it to create a 1.75 million fund to build infrastructure. And the results were all around us in Birmingham: the Law Courts, Corporation Street, Highbury House. He showed real vision and planning, but also he showed a real understanding of community need. And if you fast forward 140 years to today, it's not the gas lights of Joe Chamberlain's days that are lighting Birmingham. It's a secure, affordable energy supply that is powering the hospitals, the homes, the businesses in Birmingham. But as a country, our energy security is not assured. The UK is coming out of what I call a period of energy plenty. The North Sea is in decline. Over a third of the power generation we currently have on needs to change in the next 15 to 20 years. And within a decade, 80% of the gas that we currently need will have to be imported. So that's a huge challenge. And to meet that challenge, I believe that we need to have the same vision, the same planning that Joe Chamberlain showed here in the 1870s, because we need, as Tim said, a sustained investment in energy technology, and that needs to ensure a balanced fuel mix, but it also needs to ensure a low-carbon future. So in short, I believe the UK needs investment in electricity and gas, big and small, onshore and offshore, and it needs to be across the United Kingdom. And so when companies like Centrica undertake these projects, they must be done for and not to communities. Community acceptance is absolutely crucial. And you may say, well, that's quite idealistic. But for me, that's about engagement. And engagement is a term in our industry that is thrown around an awful lot, and I think it's often misunderstood. What I mean by engagement is involvement. Because if you involve me in a decision, then I feel significant. And if I feel significant, then I may not agree with you, but I'm willing to have that debate, and that's absolutely crucial. I think we can do more to engage local communities. I think we can also do more to engage more broadly in energy and help people understand the context of the decisions that we have to make as a country, because they are nationally important decisions. Now, the title of today's topic is something that evokes the spirit of NIMBYism. And I think it was only last week that I first heard the term CAVES, Communities Against Virtually Everything. Now, that is funny, but there's nothing wrong with people caring about where they live and wanting to protect that. And the best companies now and the best companies in the future will embrace that, and they will engage in that in the way that I've just described. I also think that we can learn a lot from nuclear in the 1980s. And if you look at the 1980s, the way nuclear was perceived, there was an awful lot of opposition to it, in the same way as there is to most technologies in energy at the moment. I have a slide that somebody sent me that's got 4 pictures on. One is people saying no to shale gas, another is people saying no to the wind farm, another is people saying no to biomass, and the other is people saying no to gas. So there is a question about how we meet that balanced energy mix. I think the reason that nuclear was so successful, and if you look at nuclear now, people who have hosted nuclear power stations in their communities have supported their recommissioning, because the debate has turned from one of opposition to one of, we can see the jobs, the supply chain, the skills, the economic benefit, and we want more of that. The two other things that made nuclear successful. The first is that the nuclear industry, as Tim said, really led the way in community engagement and continues to do so. The second is the communities that have hosted nuclear power stations were open to a discussion and a debate. They didn't just close the door and say no, and that's been absolutely crucial. So just briefly on shale gas, if I may. Tim obviously alluded to this, I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about it as well. My company, Centrica Energy, took a 25% stake in Quadrilla's licence in Bowland, which will be, if planning permission is granted, the first 2 wells in the UK to be drilled, fracked and flow tested. And shale has got potential, but we mustn't overestimate that potential. And at one end of the scale, you've got people who will tell you that it's the answer to life, the universe and everything, it's going to bring down your bills. And at the other end of the scale, you've got people who will tell you that it's absolutely a disaster, it's Armageddon. Now, neither of those things is true, and neither of those things is helpful. I think what we need to do is drill a well in Lancashire and see how much, if any, of the gas that is under Lancashire is extractable. But making sense of all of the conflicting messages around shale is quite difficult. So what does it mean for local communities? What does it mean for energy prices? What does it mean for jobs? What about earthquakes and water and protesters? What I can say is that Centrica will do this safely and Centrica will do this responsibly. And we have created, along with our partners Quadrilla, possibly the most comprehensive environmental impact assessment undertaken in the UK. But if the industry is to take off, we need to harness local support. And that means a couple of things. Firstly, it means companies like mine, along with government, along with LEPs, funding local supply chain to make sure that the jobs and the products are purchased locally. It also means that we need the local college, Blackpool and Fylde College, to be the national shale college so that skills are built in the area. And thirdly, it means regulators and academics need to be talking about the facts around shale in the face of so much fiction. And it's great, I have to say, to see Tim and the Conservative Party taking a lead on this in a very sensible way. So just in conclusion then, 140 years ago, Joe Chamberlain had the vision for community engagement that resonates to this day. He was a liberal, and he clearly saw the light and became a Conservative. And I'm sure that Matthew and Tim will hope that's repeated across the board in May next year. But he built a city that would last 100 years, and what we need to do now is build an energy infrastructure and an approach to energy projects that will last for the next 100. And so my call to you, to national leaders, to civic leaders, to local communities, is if you let us in, if you let us have the conversation with you, we can build the nation's energy future together. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabe. Ben, from your perspective, IPSOS MORI, what's the sort of public feeling on this? We know some people's feelings.
I mean, I think I love the public. I spend my life trying to work out what they think, but they don't always agree. I mean, on this, when you ask people whose responsibility is it to ultimately sort out Britain's energy supply, 16% think it might be the private sector, 13% think the public themselves have something to do with it, and 54% say actually it's got to be done by government. And I think in that, and I'll come on to the statistics about different types of energy and wind farms and all the rest of it, but I think ultimately, and this is, and I say this as an opinion pollster, this is actually an area where you probably want to do some opinion polls, but not actually act on them too much, or not necessarily interpret what people say literally, because on infrastructure, quite frankly, you're going to have to make some very, very difficult decisions, and people won't always agree with them. I think the idea of engagement is an excellent one. Governments of all sorts have wanted to engage with the great British public massively over the last 2 decades, and a lot of the time the answer has just simply been 2 fingers. We have a media whose aim is not necessarily to elucidate and explain. And the situation we're in is that 28% of us say we trust the energy companies, 44% of us say we don't. Now that's better than ministers, because only 19% of us say we trust them. But to be honest, that's never changed. That has, since we started asking that question in 1983, it hasn't changed. Only 40% of you trust me. And that's gone down actually, because there are too many opinion pollsters. But I mean, I think, but this is a challenge. When we survey the chief executives of FTSE companies, since the great crash, every year they have been worried about low demand and the Eurozone. and the availability of credit. Now they are worried about Britain's infrastructure. They want us to do something. And I think in terms of the arguments that might take at least informed public opinion with us, there are some key issues. It's fascinating to me how concern about climate change has declined in Britain over the last 6 or 7 years. Currently 60% of us say we're worried about it. It was 82% in 2005. All sorts of reasons about that. What we are particularly concerned about, though, and anybody who says they've got a source of cheap energy will be extremely popular, is our ability to pay the bills. 84% of people in Britain are now worried about the affordability of energy. And almost as concerning is Mr. Putin. 81% of us are concerned about energy security in this country. So if it's going to be homegrown, whether it's wind power, hydro or nuclear, that is extremely important, as well as people's, of course, awareness that fossil fuel will eventually run out. 78% of us say that we're aware of that, and that's an issue. Now, hypothetically at least, in surveys, the most popular forms of energy, of course, are solar, hydro and wind, although wind's popularity, for those of you who don't like it, is down from 82% to 64%. Gas is at 59% of us saying we're favourably disposed to it, and nuclear has about 34% of people who say we like it. However, the nuclear industry, as we've just heard, has done a good job in reassuring the public, and anxiety about that is dropping year on year. Only 47% of us now say we're concerned about it. That was high as 60% just a few years ago. And more people support replacing current nuclear power stations than not doing so, and particularly if we can convince them that it's safe. So I think all of the arguments have to be around price security and energy security generally, but ultimately this is something where benign despotism, and I say this as an opinion pollster, is probably going to be involved. The end.
Thanks, Ben. Great.
Thank you very much. I'll start off by saying broadly I agree with Tim when it comes to the national picture, but just to put in context about London, I think it's worth saying that London is growing the fastest that it's actually ever done in numbers in its history. So since the current mayor was elected, Boris was elected 6.5 years ago, it's about another 600,000 people. So we're looking at growth at around 100,000 a year, which is quicker than, in fact, during the interwar period when we built the tubes out to what are now the outer suburbs of London. And our electricity demand is going up between 1% and 4% a year. And as we seek to electrify our transport and perhaps some of our heating, that's only going to, I suppose, increase much further. So, in London, from an urban perspective, we have quite a challenge. Our substations are broadly at firm capacity. We are seeing some of the electricity distribution infrastructure not holding back development, but certainly delaying it more than we think is reasonable. So we've been talking to government and Ofgem about some of the regulations over strategic investment in electricity distribution infrastructure. We also think that our energy supply needs to be secure, affordable and low carbon. How this country got into its position where our energy capacity headroom is extremely worrying in the next year is a question for the former government, I would say, of how we got ourselves in this mess, but we are where we are, and clearly the demand side response that Tim touched on is extremely important because it gets a lot less frightening if you can lop off those peak loads in the early morning and in the late afternoon when people come home. Clearly we can manage that probably a lot quicker with some software solutions and incentivising businesses and hopefully domestic consumers too to switch off their washing machines or switch off all their fridges if they're a big hotel chain, than we can to build a whole pile of nuclear power stations or whatever. What we want to do in London is to bring more energy generation capacity into the city. So obviously post-war with the Clean Air Act, we saw the closure of Battersea Power Station, which is now finally being redeveloped, or Bankside Power Station, which is now the most successful art gallery I think in the world. But we saw the closure of those. We want to see more energy generation capacity coming back into the city because we feel that that is where we got the greatest opportunity in an urban area, perhaps through CHP in the first instance, but perhaps through heat source pumps later on, we can have that lower carbon, more secure and more affordable energy supply. So we're doing what we can to bring that in. We want to see 25% by 2025 generated locally to bring that in. So we're using the planning system We're also using a market measure. We're applying to Ofgem for a junior electricity licence, and we think that's about to be awarded, and that will give those smaller generators 20 to 30% better price for electricity than they currently get for the big six. So we can see that as really incentivising investment into that infrastructure. And finally, we have a very big consumer in Transport for London, which uses more electricity than all city leads. So we have a customer, we think, for those power stations. So with a combination of the market measure and the planning system and a guaranteed customer, we could really incentivise the investment in that energy generation infrastructure in London. When it comes to community, we're already seeing some of these heat networks delivering cheaper heat, sometimes for some of the most vulnerable residents. So there's one scheme in Islington which has been up and running for about 2 or 3 years now, and that's providing cheaper heat to some of the local social housing, but also some of the new builds near there. It's in Clerkenwell, just south of City Road in Islington, and also the big waste energy facility called Stelchip, which was built about 20 odd years ago. South East London combined heat power plant. Well, it took 20 years. It now is a combined heat power plant. So, and some of the social housing units in Southwark there have been plugged in, and these are residents who are now seeing cheaper heat than it would otherwise be. And that is surely, again, is the benefits for local residents. And you can see how you're going to get cheaper heat when you otherwise pay. You're going to want to have that kind of stuff nearby you rather than to be a YIMBY rather than a YIMBY.
Sam?
Okay, thanks, James. Before he became DEC's chief scientific advisor, David Mackay wrote a book on renewable energy called Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air, which is an excellent book. In the section on wind power in that book, there is a map of Britain. About half of the country is shaded white. These are the parts of the country that are within about 2 kilometres of existing towns, cities, villages, hamlets. He argues that these places would presumably be places where you couldn't build wind farms because they are too near to other people. The rest of the map is shaded black, and he argues that these are areas that would also probably have to be excluded from wind farm development because they are tranquil and peaceful countryside areas that you wouldn't want to disrupt with wind farms. So to get your wind farm built, it's really simple. You just build somewhere that isn't either shaded white or shaded black. This is not a problem that is restricted just to wind or even just to energy infrastructure. We see it with wind and shale, as has been mentioned today. We also see it with transmission lines and incinerators, housing, rail, roads, pretty much everything. In the previous times, we were able to build a lot of energy infrastructure in places that were inherently either urban, as Matthew's alluded to, the power stations in London, or otherwise industrial. We built coal power stations near to coal mines, that kind of thing. Even the CCGTs that were built in the sort of dash for gas in the 90s were mostly built in kind of industrial parks on the edges of cities, places that had access to big power transmission lines and that kind of thing. But with some of the new technologies that are coming forward, wind particularly, shale as well, geography is much more important, and some of those choices we were able to make previously about where things were sited go away. We have to build these things where the conditions are appropriate, where it's either windy or where there is gas under the ground. That means that inherently some of these technologies are going to go to places that are more rural than previous energy infrastructure has been built. And this matters. We've seen the difference, for example, in the attitudes to various shale developments in Balcombe on the edge of the South Downs compared with those in Salford and on Merseyside, which have seen a fraction, if any, protests at all. I think it's worth pointing out, reiterating, that investment in new energy infrastructure isn't optional. For decarbonisation, to replace aging equipment, to secure energy supplies, we are going to need new stuff. And this can either be done in a way where it is backed by its neighbours, or it can be imposed on them against their wishes. I hope everybody here would agree that the incentives to encourage local communities to accept these things is preferable to simply imposing on them from the top. I think that kind of top-down imposition is one of the things that contributes to people's distrust of the political system. Coe's theorem, an economic term, suggests compensation as a viable option to this. In its simplest form, if I lose some quality of life from a wind farm, say, being developed near to me, I should be compensated by the wind farm. If there is still enough profit after everybody affected has been compensated, it's a win-win and development should go ahead. And clearly there are practical challenges to this theory. Property rights for quality of life are poorly defined, if not completely non-existent, and transaction costs are significant, which removes one of the key assumptions of the theory. But in reality, it's possible to make some concessions to practicality while still keeping the broad thrust of that approach. I think central government largely should be staying as far away from this as possible, but local councils are in a good position to establish the parameters within which the public can have the final say. So decisions that local councils might make include, do you want to decide this by a simple majority? Are we looking for a 50% plus one kind of vote? What kind of turnout might we need in some kind of referendum or poll? That kind of thing. But I think largely it's best to keep these decisions between the developer and the community itself. That allows the nature of any compensation to respond best to the individual circumstances of each project and the place it might be. So preferred methods of compensation, if you like, might be improvements to community facilities, in better schools, paid to keep libraries open or to improve parks. In other cases, people might prefer payments that lower their bills, as Tim suggested, or even cold hard cash might be more tempting. I don't think there is any reason for central government to be prescriptive about how this might work. It's much better for the process of haggling to take place that enables you to reach an answer that everyone can live with.
Thank you. Clearly geography is an important issue. Tim, if I may, before we open it up to questions, how do you think we sort of match the national clear need for energy with the sort of local demands of in my backyard?
Well, I think we don't really, is the answer, I'm afraid. I think there's a problem that clearly a very substantial amount of investment in new infrastructure has to take place. And this applies to the transport sector as well as energy, where the problems are very similar, actually. And it's needed very urgently. A Premier League economy in the 21st century does need a world-class infrastructure. After top-class education is probably the second most important precondition. And our planning system is actually obstructing the establishment of such an infrastructure. And I think we will need to be a little more aggressive in trying to drive this through. But I do think that what can be done by local negotiation, by market solutions, that is the way to achieve acceptable outcomes. And I see nothing wrong at all, in principle, in sharing financial benefits, which actually both the developers, who are probably private sector companies, and the country derive from getting this infrastructure in place with the local communities who are bearing the environmental and physical pain.
Gabe, obviously, Tim mentioned INEOS, their announcement on Sunday about sharing some of the benefits with local residents. Is that something Centrica and Quinn will do?
Well, so for anybody who doesn't know, INEOS, which is a chemical company that's recently moved into energy, announced that they would provide 6% of production revenues as benefits to local communities, part of that to landowners, part of it to local communities. And the industry before that had agreed that for every well that was drilled and fracked, £100,000 would be provided. So in the Bowland Shale, for example, there are 8 wells that are proposed, and so that'd be £800,000 that goes to the local community. On top of that, 1% of production revenue. So that's in the production phase, not in the exploration phase, and my understanding is that's what INEOS is talking about as well. Now, the question around how much of that is clearly about the economics of the project, and believe it or not, shale gas is a marginal business. So any shale developer, just as any developer of any kind of infrastructure, needs to think about their operating costs, their other costs, and then balance all of those against one another. We haven't seen INEOS's workings yet. We look forward to that conversation with them, and clearly if there's more that can be done, then that's a conversation we'll have.
Okay. So open up to questions. Before you ask a question, can you say your name and where you're from in terms of organisation or constituency, just to help the panel, and also please give a number of people in the room and the time. Can we have questions and not statements? Thanks.
Good morning. Good morning, Matty Knight from Siemens. I was interested in Simon's remarks actually, and can the panel perhaps discuss the difference between community benefit and community ownership, and hazard a guess as to why the government is pushing so hard for community ownership rather than community benefit?
Simon, do you want to say about that?
I guess, I don't have a strong view either way on whether community ownership is something that is something that should be pushed as a matter of public policy. I think in certain circumstances it's a good thing for those communities that they have the chance to get involved in a productive, successful business, essentially, is what you're talking about. I know it's something that has been driven much more strongly in places like Germany, where a lot of the expansion in the German renewable sector has been driven by sort of dentists' collectives and this kind of thing, owning solar farms or small-scale wind farms. I mean, I guess the big hurdle to it is getting the initial capital together, and I don't know if that's something that is always feasible in a lot of the proposed sites in the UK, and in those situations it may be that ownership by an energy company is more sensible, and with some transfer of residual either profits or other money, but in principle I think there is space for both.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the problem with community benefit is this. It's a question. Well, one question is how much, because what people, and it's similar with, this goes right back to a lot of the original housing proposals when Grant Shapps was housing minister, and even before the election. The public just aren't convinced that it's going to translate into anything meaningful. So at least ownership, hypothetically, gives them more transparency. But again, all of this is not what we would call a high salience issue. I mean, people aren't champing at the bit to own energy infrastructure. They just want somebody else to fix it. Thank you very much.
Tim, what are your thoughts?
I don't think there's a big difference really. I think that there's room for both. I think that community ownership may well be a way to unlock the resistance of some communities to proposed development. I think community benefit, the area I'm concerned about there is giving money to local council does not often translate into individual voter satisfaction. I'd much rather see a system of channeling the cash straight to the households, rather than building another, better public lavatory on the edge of the car park.
Another question at the back. Sorry, Bosh.
Thank you. Luke Warren from the Carbon Capture and Storage Association. So Tim, you can probably imagine I was very interested in your comments on the core prospect for CCS here in the UK, particularly given that later on this week, in fact, the world's first coal-fired power station fitted with CCS will officially be opened in Canada. They're certainly very bullish on the technology and where the costs of a technology are. We've looked at costs in the UK. Again, we're very confident of where those costs can be within a sensible time frame. And actually, we would argue that probably the biggest challenge we face is the reluctance for government to allow CCS to access the same level of support that's been available for some of the other low-carbon technologies. So I'd just be a little bit, interested to understand a little bit more about some of your reasoning behind the core prospect for CCS. Thank you.
Well, let me be absolutely clear. CCS is the single technology that the world most needs to tackle climate change because of the huge amounts of coal that are likely to be burnt, not necessarily in Europe, but particularly in Asia and North America. So we need it desperately. I just want to be very realistic about how quickly that's going to happen. We shouldn't make policy on this assumption that by 2025 economically viable CCS is going to be available. I don't think it is. It'd be fantastic if it was, and whoever gets there first deserves to get the most enormous financial reward. The Canadian example you mentioned, yes, it is going to start. It is also the recipient of huge amounts of public subsidy. It's only happening because of vast transfer of resources from the taxpayer. And that could be achieved anywhere if we're willing to spend that amount of money. It doesn't at the moment, in my view, offer good value for money. What really depresses me is when the government announced they're going to have 4 schemes with each accompanied by £1 billion of public support, hardly any of the major energy companies thought it was worth even applying. Their view, with all the resource available to them to look into the future and the technologies that were being developed and the research that were being undertaken, their view was this is so far away from being viable, it's not even worth bidding for. They know much more about it than I do, so I just draw my own conclusion from that. But I don't want to knock the idea, if you and your members of the CCSA, of whom I've been great supporters, as you know, and will continue to be, and the report that my committee just published on CCS was by no means all negative, but I just want our policymakers not to assume that somehow there's a holy grail around the corner which is going to allow us to burn all the coal. That is not in sight, in my view.
Gabe, is that fair?
Well, I'm not sure I personally know more about CCS than Tim does, but obviously people in Centrica have looked at this very hard. I mean, I agree completely with what Tim said. It would be absolutely fantastic if it happened quickly. I think the thing that energy companies, particularly energy companies that have supply businesses, have to be very, very careful about is how we spend our money and what we spend it on. We have to spend it on the lowest cost, lowest regret technologies, because otherwise that is either bill payers' money or it's taxpayers' money that's being spent. So I would love to see CCS, and I think the work that your organisation is doing is fantastic, and I very much hope we do see it soon.
This question.
Can I just comment quickly on that? I think one of the things that CCS does demonstrate quite well is that the recent set of policies that the government has been pushing through in its energy bill, the electricity market reform, has been specifically tailored towards different sets of technologies with different solutions for them. And I feel, as I suspect you do, that CCS has somewhat got lost in the middle of that. I think this demonstrates very clearly the problem with policy that is oriented around particular technological solutions that has the effect of sort of excluding ones that aren't foremost in the sort of civil servants' minds, or whoever it is who's drafting the legislation. I think that's one of the reasons why a more technologically neutral approach to policy making is actually more helpful, because it avoids, in this case, sort of keeping you guys out of the sector.
At the back.
Thank you. Sheila Wren from the John Muir Trust. I probably fall into the NIMBY spectrum somewhere along the line, although I don't like the phrase much. Our interest is in protecting some of our remoter areas in uplands. And my question is about spatial planning. A lot of the anxiety and opposition that arises is because people can't see an end to it. Everything seems to be up for grabs, and all they're seeing is the landscape and natural places being consumed by infrastructure. We feel that very keenly in Scotland. So my question is there not a place somewhere for spatial planning? The Scottish Government have just adopted and recognised 43 core areas of wild land in Scottish planning policy. Could we not look at similar principles for England and Wales for our irreplaceable landscapes such as peatlands and ancient woodlands?
Well, I mean, that would be popular with the public. The question, and absolutely, but of course the question will come, where else is it going to go? I mean, the difficulty in all of this is that we aren't going to please everybody. But I think, the green, I was just, when you were speaking, it made me think of the green belt, which we could go and have another debate about somewhere else. But of course, that's pretty popular with anybody nearby.
Obviously in London, things are different, there's not as much space, but how do you sort of match that?
Well, I suppose in London we're quite lucky in that in much of it, the NIMBYism is not quite as strong as perhaps in other places. I think that it's quite, as a public authority, it's often quite difficult because the people who are opposed to things are often the most active and the most vocal And it becomes a point where a relatively small number of people can tie you up and delay everything so much it's not worth progressing. And it's often we have to because you're not going to please everybody, but you have to make the difficult decision because the broad majority are quiet and probably accept it, but you get tied up and distracted, I suppose, with a small number of very active people who are very upset because they are immediately affected by whatever it might be. And there's always a danger that, and I think the Balkan one was an example of that, where a relatively small number of people last summer, of course, absolute chaos there, and clearly frightened off to a degree some investors, I think, and I think it's often the role of government to try and mitigate that as much as possible, but there are always going to be some people who are absolutely opposed to whatever it might be. And I think it's mitigating that as much as possible and ensuring that the broad majority of people are at least accepting that piece of infrastructure, whatever it might be.
Well, of course, we already do have some areas which do have greater protection than others in the planning system. It is a bit harder to put up pylons in a national park than it is elsewhere, though I think not even possible even there. I don't think there'll be many more pylons built after about 2020. I think, I can see the attraction because this might be a way of making it easier to develop elsewhere.
Yes.
The problem would be
Yes.
that the people
Yeah.
who didn't live in the areas which have got this protection would not be perhaps terrifically popular with them. But from the point of view of an infrastructure developer, it might actually simplify their process and speed up a bit, which would be a good outcome. But I said that doesn't really answer the question very well. I don't think there isn't an easy answer to this question. I just observed, interestingly, that I saw this morning the figures for renewable energy in Scotland, which is now very close to 50% of the electricity in Scotland generated by renewables, which they managed to achieve without too much opposition to the wind farms, and of course they've got a bit more space there than we have in my constituency.
We've objected a lot.
Yeah, sure. Well, we're paying for it as well. English consumers, it's yet another, not such an obvious transfer of resource from England and Scotland, but it's quite a big one. Yeah.
Sheila, I just have a quick answer to your question as well. I think I agree absolutely with what everybody said, but if I go back to what I was saying in my opening address, which is about involvement, I think there is more that we can do. I'm not sure that's something that we look at on a national scale. I think it's about working with developers themselves. I had a very interesting conversation yesterday with the Wildlife Trust about this very thing, about looking at maps of the UK and trying to figure out and work with one another if there is a way to do it. So there can be no guarantee, obviously, but I've had this conversation with many NGOs and other organisations. I and my organisation believe very, very keenly that we have to protect areas of ecological significance and biodiversity. And so, if you're willing to have a conversation, it'd be great to catch you afterwards.
Good. At the back.
Thank you, Chair. Paul Monaghan from Cooperative Energy. We're a small energy supplier who not just sources from renewables but community energy wherever we can. I think it's very interesting how countries such as Germany and Denmark, right of centre countries, have depoliticised the deployment of renewables, and they've done it by having community ownership on top of community benefit. So you have the situation, for example, in Denmark, where any turbine above 26 metres, the local community have a right to invest in that turbine, up to 25%. Now, the government's given itself some backstop legislation in the infrastructure bill to introduce this in the UK, which we think is welcome. However, and this is my question, the government has also, just a couple of weeks ago, closed a consultation which is going to remove tax reliefs from people who invest in renewables, community renewables. Isn't that insane, given we know that investment in community renewables could actually depoliticise this area? In Denmark, they don't have a NIMBY problem. They have a problem with people temporarily moving into areas so they can invest in renewables. Couldn't we have that? And isn't this the biggest way we can depoliticise renewables in this country? Individuals across the country having a stake. Very Margaret Thatcher vision, actually, as well.
Yes, I think the reason why the particular tax benefits are being withdrawn is because the government, probably the Treasury, feels there's enough subsidy going into renewable technologies as it is in a more direct way. I'm not sure. I don't have a very strong view either way about these. I have taken it up on behalf of some people actually, but I don't have a very strong view. I do think that we should certainly be facilitating much more distributed generation, which often will mean small schemes, and facilitating people's ability to sell into the grid if you've got a sort of solar farm somewhere which is generating grid. I think the obstacles sometimes, the hidden obstacles in the transmission and distribution section, I mean, National Grid, in my view, are often less than optimal in their approach to this. I'm being polite, I'm normally good at that about them. But I think that therefore the idea of getting a much bigger range of small-scale generation, often community-owned, around the country, these people can quite so often generate quite close to consumers as well as it happens. We need to do everything we can to facilitate that through the planning system and through the incentives that we offer.
In London, we are seeing an increasing number of community energy schemes. So on the roofs of the flat roofs of quite high tower blocks. I mean, PV in London is quite hard to deploy because of the lots of heritage areas and sort of overhanging of tall buildings. But we've seen quite an exciting number of ones. So Bricks Energy is the one that has grabbed quite a lot of attention. And there you had social benefits as well being put in. So you've got local people, they crowdsource the finance in large parts, so you've got local residents who invest in it. They're on top of a council estate where you obviously have a portion of people who are in fuel poverty, so it's also helping to pay for some of the retrofitting of that estate. But it's also got apprentices, so it's got people, local kids in the area who've learned how to install solar. They've also done the financing, so they do the accounting as well. And we're seeing that proliferating across London, seeing councils involved. And I think we're beginning to see interest from investors, just pension funds, in those sorts of schemes. So I think it's quite an exciting time when it comes to relatively small scale community energy schemes that can aggregate up to, I think, quite an exciting progression in our energy infrastructure.
I think, well, speaking from an organisation that is commonly in favour of going to Scandinavia and nicking ideas and importing them to the UK, I think it is worth recognising that there are some other distinctions between the Danish case and the German case as well, and the UK in terms of public attitudes that are not simply explained by tax breaks. I think the attitudes to the technologies more broadly and to environmental policies more broadly are somewhat more favourable in both circumstances. That said, I think we go back to the answer to the earlier question. There is a place for community ownership for certain projects, and there's no reason to discourage it, but equally I'm not sure there is much ground to sort of encourage it as a specific public policy area.
Next question. Chap here. Sorry.
Hello there, Peter Smith from National Energy Action. We're a fuel poverty charity. So about £47 billion a year is spent on energy infrastructure, and not a penny of that is spent making homes more energy efficient. The Treasury stands to benefit quite considerably from the deployment of low carbon technologies. Last year, bagging about £1.5 billion through VAT and carbon taxes. Is there a rational case for, as well as those generators and those low carbon projects, remunerating local communities, but for the government to put its hands in its pockets to invest in energy efficiency, which could help reduce or mitigate the need for any of this infrastructure in the first place?
Well, I imagine Tim has something to say on this as well. I mean, there is a lot of investment in energy efficiency through bills, through the eco scheme, through various other schemes that have been in place before. Clearly, fuel poverty is a huge issue, and it's one that we need to do more on, I think, as a country. The question is, what is done through the bill, what is done through general taxation, how do you make that a progressive thing? But I think, your point really is about energy efficiency, and doing that in the right way, that isn't just about solid wall insulation and loft insulation as we have now, but is actually more a behavioural thing, which is very much sort of where I come from on this, is really important. If you think about energy efficiency at the moment, a lot of people think about energy efficiency in the way that they think about recycling. It's a nice to have. It's also pitched very much in a green space, whereas although that's very important, the thing about energy efficiency is it can save you an awful lot of money in your bill. So I think that's a really important thing to do in that space. But the government and energy companies are doing a lot in energy efficiency, and particularly in fuel poverty.
Well, there is a real problem with fuel poverty, but the solution isn't in energy policy, it's actually in social security policy to make sure households have enough income. However, there are some aspects of energy policy which can address fuel poverty, of which energy efficiency is one. We should certainly, to the extent we're using taxpayers' money to promote energy efficiency, we should focus that on the fuel poor households, no question about that. I think there are other things that we can do. As I say, fundamentally we've got to make sure that incomes are sufficiently high. And it is a much greater problem because of the rise in energy costs over the last 10 years than it was. I think that we must make sure that even the fuel poor have access to the smart technology which will allow them to get more control over their energy expenditure in the future. When we can all switch on and off our household deep freeze, what it is, actually that can be done by a chip, through our mobile phones, we will empower consumers. The technology already is available to do this. And if we have time of use pricing, the key is to let the market in a bit more. We have time of use pricing, so you insist on having your maximum consumption between 5 and 7 in the evening, you're going to pay a lot more. Whereas if you just defer, you amend your lifestyle slightly and dramatically cut on energy costs, we can empower people to make those decisions. And the people who need those most of all are the fuel poor. They would then, for a relatively small adjustment to their lifestyle, they could have a very big adjustment to their energy costs. And this is within reach now. It's happening much faster than most people realise. But we've got to facilitate it and not obstruct it.
Ben obviously said 84% that.
Well, yes, it's a huge issue, and I think all of the smart metering technologies, the personal control, all of those things are very promising. The challenge is still that if you look at smartphone penetration in this country, for example, which is at 64%, amongst older working class people it's at 11%, and it's not going up. And so there's going to be a real issue about getting people to use this stuff. And what I'm very seized by when I look at this, and we're doing a lot of the evaluations of some of the schemes, is that often, rational people in charge of these things, so tell people they will save money, and we'll give you a collective, you can group together your neighbours, we'll insulate your loft for you for virtually nothing, and take up zero. It's understanding people's psychology, which we've really got to get into. When you say we'll clear your loft, and while we're at it, we'll put in insulation, take up goes up 500-fold. It's about this. So it's what is the hook? And we still haven't cracked that in any meaningful form. We are far too rational.
Question in the middle.
Hi there, my name's Simon Main, I'm from Brunswick. Isn't potentially the problem the structure of the industry itself? We've got a vertically integrated model with our current crop of utilities who are still our main investors in energy infrastructure, who basically the two sides of their model are starting to diverge so radically. We've already heard that the downstream part, the retail, is turning more into a tech business. The upstream part, as Gabe has told us, is turning more into a community involvement business. Is it time actually that what we're doing is that we need to separate these two sides of the industry and actually allow them to diversify and get on with what they're best at?
Gabe, answer that.
I'm not sure, Simon, when I said that the upstream business is turning into a community engagement business. I said community engagement is really important in terms of making the business work. So vertical integration, well, clearly there's a Competition and Markets Authority investigation at the moment, and so I'm not going to go into that. And that is something we said we support, because if that clears the air and helps rebuild trust in the industry, that's great. Vertical integration, we believe very strongly, helps consumers. That's why we do it. It protects consumers from prices. If we had to buy all of the gas that is supplied to British Gas customers or other customers in the UK from the market, then that would spike and peak and trough, and that isn't in the interest of consumers. So we believe vertical integration is important in that sense. Now, is the energy industry changing and adapting and evolving? Of course it is, and it needs to continue doing that. And you pointed out the downstream space being about technology. That's hugely exciting. That's going to benefit consumers as well. Tim talked about smart, but there are lots of other technology solutions around. British Gas has just launched a product called Hive, which allows you from your mobile phone to control your heating at home. So a lot in that space. From an upstream point of view, there is the question about indigenous sources versus international sources. I think the thing I would stress is that it's a balanced energy mix that we need to achieve. Some of that's indigenous, some of it's international, some of it's renewable, some of it's conventional. But vertical integration is helpful in our view.
I wouldn't mind quickly go back on the energy efficiency question, if you don't mind. If you're looking at London buildings, we have 80% of them are still going to be with us in 50 years' time. And despite all the new development we're saying, we don't believe in just levelling all our terraces like they do in some countries, to the Far East. And it's an amazing thought when you think that all the politics about energy prices, but actually per unit in the UK, we actually have some of the lowest prices in Europe. But because our buildings, including those buildings that are still going to be here in 50 years' time, are the leakiest, so our bills are quite high. So in fact, energy efficiency, which has, I suppose, had a bit of a bad, because of difficulties of the Green Deal and because of the constant government fiddling around with the eco scheme, again because the politics got dragged in about this time last year, it has been quite difficult to deliver at the scale that we really need. In London we're doing all we can through aggregating up social housing and housing associations to do retrofitting at scale, but it is difficult. It's not the silver bullet. Some people, I think some of the Green Party view is energy efficiency is the silver bullet to all these problems, which it actually isn't, because we see certain power demand going very quickly. But some certainty would be handy, and we have seen constant fiddling around with the retrofit schemes, and it would be very nice if we had some certainty for quite a while, so we could actually get on, public authorities like ours could aggregate those schemes up and do retrofitting at scale to get those terraces more energy efficient, because we are going to keep them.
And in terms of Simon's question on the structure of the industry and the way it's changing, is that affecting what you're seeing?
I think what is quite interesting is we're seeing more entrants into the market. So we've seen companies like OVO, which have obviously done quite a lot of PR, but we're also seeing, and I mentioned it earlier, some local authorities are getting interested. I think Bristol, is looking at this. We've got our own our unit electricity licence in London, which we're not going to start becoming a supplier to individuals, to domestic consumers, but we're seeing ourselves, and we hope small generators, helping to break some of the big six hegemony we're seeing, which is, I think, part of the point about the competition. We saw, I think when Labour came to power, something like 40 energy companies, and it did reduce a great deal over that time, and that's where some of the problems have been, I'd say.
On vertical integration, I think it is a business structure that has a lot of advantages, some disadvantages. I think that the CMA inquiry will delve into this in greater detail, but at the moment I haven't seen enough evidence to suggest the disadvantages so massively outweigh the advantages that it's something that should be legislated away. Clearly the CMA may come to a different conclusion, but that's a long way off. On the energy efficiency question, I guess one of the things that was on the subject for today's event, energy efficiency is one element of potential infrastructure spending that isn't really subject to the planning problems that we've seen with a lot of the rest of the energy system. And so in that sense, it's a slightly easier to get through system. It's not subject to some of those hidden costs that Tim was alluding to at the start that are imposed by the slowness of the planning system. But clearly we have seen that in other areas the policy on energy efficiency has simply not been up to scratch. The Green Deal has been a bad flop, and I think reorienting eco towards fuel poor, potentially trying to find more ways of investing in energy efficiency and spending less money upstream on some of the more expensive technologies that we're funding is both a way to decarbonise more cheaply and to tackle some of those fuel poverty issues that you and the other panellists have mentioned.
Okay, we've probably got time for one last question in the chat. Hollywood Daily Telegraph is any bias. He has had his hand up for a long time.
Yes, good morning, Peter Stevens. I just wondered whether the panel may be able to suggest the most acceptable form of renewable generation and transmission of power in protected landscapes. I speak as a former chairman of AOBs across England, Wales and Northern Ireland.
Well, it goes solar, hydro, and wind in order of popularity. So stick solar on all the buildings. It's not. Yeah, I know. I think there isn't an easy answer. I was really intrigued at your answer that we aren't going to be building any more pylons, because I thought the cables got very hot underground, Tim.
Well, cables are not sort of environmentally, they have some downsides.
Yeah.
But I think the visual downsides of pylons are so great now that I suspect that the country won't tolerate even not just in A and B, but anywhere. Lots more pylons. I mean, and given that National Grid have been very, shall I say, misleading about the additional costs of pylons. They for a long time claimed it was about 15 times more expensive to build pylons. When independent research was commissioned for the second time, because the first time National Grid didn't really cooperate with them, it was discovered actually between 3 and 5 times more expensive. It's still more expensive, but that's a very big difference. And I think that the country increasingly will say, well, we're willing to pay that to protect ourselves from the
Just an observation on Ben's point, it seemed for quite a while, at least in the polling, that the popularity of different energy sources is sort of reversed from the cost of those energy sources.
Yes. But of course, it's not. When we're asking them, asking them that what do they think? They can't tell you accurately what the cost is. Of course.
Absolutely. Now, hopefully, and this was mentioned earlier, if the costs of solar keep coming down significantly, and if there is movement on the storage problem, then that might stop being the case, and some of the things that are most acceptable might also become the ones that are more affordable too. But I don't think we're at that point yet.
Just on them, I think I agree with the batting order that the priority order that Ben mentioned. I think, let's be clear, solar will be actually probably cheaper than gas quite quickly. In parts of America it already is cheaper than gas, and it will be here within a relatively short space of time. Wind would be transformed if we unlock the storage problem, and I think that's an area where more investment is needed, and there would be a justification for some public money being spent on research into energy storage, because it deals with the peak problem to a great extent as well. And this hasn't really been mentioned very much today, but I think storage is one of those areas which we need to give greater priority to.
Okay. Just to wind up, if we go from left to right, starting with Ben, if we could remove, just in one sentence, we could remove one sort of energy policy to sort of ensure our energy future is more secure for the long term, what would it be?
Remove one policy.
Put one policy in place.
I think you've just got. I think we've got to agree what it is. Say we're going to do, reach cross-party consensus and do it, and it may be in the face of public opposition. I give you Ken Livingstone. Ken Livingstone got elected as Mayor of London. He then did something on infrastructure that was deeply unpopular. He introduced the congestion charge. The Londoners didn't want the congestion charge. It turned out to sort of broadly work. It was perceived as fair, and 55% of Londoners then, having had politicians do something that was unpopular, gave him their first or second preference votes in 2004. If you just have a referendum on introducing congestion charge into cities like Manchester, Birmingham, London, it will never have happened. And similarly with this. So I think this is why I go back to, can we try and take party politics out of this, get some sort of agreement, and frankly, we will have to do it. And I speak as a paid-up member of the National Trust and everything else.
Okay.
Cross-party consensus, greater public understanding of the issues and the choices the country needs to face. But I won't go for a current policy. I'll talk about a potential future policy, which is the price freeze.
We need a carbon price that drives investment into low-carbon technology. Cross-party consensus, possibly a version of the Monetary Policy Committee, which is one of Gordon Brown's few successes. Perhaps his only success was the creation of the MPC, took the control of interest rates out of politics. We could have an energy policy committee. I'm available as the first chairman as I'm leaving Parliament next year. And I will gladly take decisions out of politics.
I think it's certainty. I referred to about the the uncertainty on energy efficiency, but we've seen. I mean, I don't know, but I assume the cost of capital went up hugely following the price freeze announcement by the opposition last year, already some energy companies are hedging forward in order in case this happens. That sort of tactical party politics, it's completely very understandable. You know, I work very closely with a politician. We have a politician on my left. I understand clearly the short-term tactics of trying to get an election and winning it, because you can't achieve anything unless you win an election. So I understand that, but it does have some very serious long-term strategic effects, and I think that, you know, it may be possible, but you ask for, you know, a pipe dream, I suppose, that having some sort of certainty in this field, and lots of fields as well, where you see, but the gentleman at the back mentioned about the tax break on, I can't remember what it was now, but the tax break that's been removed, thank you, was, again, we see that on a biodiesel project we're trying to do. We're constantly worried if the government takes away a certain tax benefit, the whole thing just falls over. And I think that sort of almost capricious changing of the rules makes it very difficult for long-term investment.
Price carbon properly. It's really that simple.
With certainty.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for coming this morning. Hope you've enjoyed it. Enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks.